On this video, I intend to do in one video a little flash review of what we talked about in all the videos of the Community Ecology lecture series. So it's another one of the biology review videos. Now if you go through this again, it's going to be really fast, so it's to your advantage to watch the full lecture series if you feel there's anything about that I'm about to say that you don't understand. Now in the first chapter of ecology, we talked about community interactions already. We talked about how members of the food web will eat each other around. And that's already community interactions. But it was in the context of transferring energy and matter throughout the ecosystem. Now in this topic, we're going to be talking more about relationships that exist between different species within the ecosystem, or different populations. In other words, community interactions. Now, these ecological relationships will help determine the quality and the nature of the ecosystem, as well as establish all kinds of cool evolutionary relationships that we're going to be talking about. Now, the most common and famous type of such relationship is what we call predation, where one organism benefits as it eats the other. Now, this kind of relationship is positive for the predator, but negative for the prey. But they have a very close-knit relationship, because you see, as the numbers of prey increase, that means there's more predators that it can eat now, so the predators will also increase. But if the predators increase too much, they start eating the prey too much, which makes the numbers of prey crash. But then that makes the numbers of predators go up, and before you know it, you have this cycling up and down. We talk more about this as typical of a predator-prey relationship. Now you may notice that it's not very neat, it's not very clear. And that's because there's a lot more that goes into this. The lynx and the hare in this example are not the only things in the ecosystem. So it's a lot more complicated than that. Remember, there's a whole food web to contend with, a whole set of cascade effects that takes place whenever one animal goes up and another animal goes down. But predation is definitely one of the most common types of interactions that occur in ecosystems. Now the cool thing about predation is that it puts pressure both in the prey and the predator to specialize, and it's part of the process of natural selection. Predators have to develop strength and speed and venom and flight and good eyesight and pack behaviors and hiding, which is called camouflage or cryptic coloration, all of which are done because of prey trying to evade the predator so well that the predator has to become better at catching and killing its prey. So pressure from the prey to escape the predator puts pressure on the predator to become better at catching the prey. Likewise, the prey tends to adapt. Herd behaviors, attentiveness behaviors, warning behaviors, behaviors like the bunny, which pretends to be dead and then just takes it in a boat, the way you run, the pattern of evasion, all kinds of things. This is even true about things like this, cryptic correlation, also called camouflage, where animals develop ways to hide in the environments or to hide their nests or their eggs so that the predators don't eat them. Or warning coloration, where the prey basically says, it's trying to send a message that I am toxic. If you eat me, you probably won't like it, so don't eat me. So they become more common in the population and together send a message to the predator, listen, these colors mean danger, avoid it at all costs. Another type of evolutionary adaptation. And sometimes animals will copy animals which look toxic, even if they're not toxic themselves. This is called mimicry. They're not really toxic, they just copy another one that's toxic to make it seem like they're toxic so they can actually go along with the same message that the toxic one is sending. And that's called Batesian mimicry, because a scientist called Bates was the one who discovered it. A different kind, called Mullerian mimicry, is when two toxic species start mimicking each other. Because instead of just sending two different messages, together they send a stronger message that this color pattern is very dangerous. And that's also something else that tends to happen. All of these things are examples of adaptations that developed in ecosystems because of closely knit relationships between predator and prey. By the way, herbivory is another type of predation, where plants are being eaten by other animals. And so plants also develop defense mechanisms against that by having thorns and spines and toxicity and secondary compounds which will actually hurt the animals which try to eat them. And meanwhile, the predators will also have developed better sense of taste, better sense of smell, or even adaptations to withstand the thorns or the toxins so they can actually eat the prey. So it's the same kind of thing. Now, in addition to predator-prey relationship, we have other relationships which are really interesting. And I'm not going to get into the examples because this video is supposed to be a review video, but there are three main types of what we call symbiotic relationships. Now, symbiotic relationships are relationships which are so closely knit that these organisms must have evolved together. Now, you saw the example of how predators and prey put pressure on each other and end up evolving those features in response to each other. But this is taking this to an extreme. It's to the point that at least one of the organisms is completely dependent on the other for its survival. Now, there's 3 types of such relationships. And the one you see in the screens, they're all examples of mutualistic relationships where both animals are benefiting. Just to do one example, the bee that goes in to get the pollen off or the nectar off the flower will also pollinate the flowers because it will transfer the pollen from one flower to the other. So it helps them both. That's an example of a mutualistic relationship. A relationship where both organisms benefits. There's also commensalistic relationships, and that's a relationship where one benefits and the other one is not harmed or benefit. So in other words, it's neutral for one and positive for the other. These little fish swimming by the big fish get protection from that big fish, but that big fish gets nothing out of it. Or the barnacles in the trees, or the barnacles which sit in the whale, the barnacles get the power of the whale flowing through the water and bringing them nutrients, but it doesn't really hurt or help the whale. So that's a commensalism relationship. And again, symbiotic because that barnacle relies on that whale to actually survive. Then you have the famous parasitism. Almost a third of the organisms on Earth are parasites because it's a very easy way to make a living. Instead of having to compete with someone who's trying to be in the same place in the environment that you're trying to be, you just basically go inside of that person or prey on that person without actually killing it. So you develop the mechanism to actually steal kind of from the person. And there's all kinds of parasitism, including ones which happen inside, like we call endoparasitism, like worms inside of your belly, or a malaria that goes inside your blood, or ectoparasitism when it's outside. And all kinds of life forms do it. And it could even be something like putting your egg on somebody else's nest and forcing a bird to spend the energy to take care of your young and feed your young while you go around and have more babies and do the same in another nest. So again, these are all examples. And since bacteria, by the way, are most common types of parasites on the world and the most common types of life on the world, parasitism is the most common way of living. Another type of relationship that happens sometimes in environments is called competition. And competition is when the relationship is a negative for both organisms. Because in the effort of actually competing for mates, competing for food, or competing for whatever resources they're trying to compete, they're actually going to hurt each other out. They will compete in every single aspect, and then both are wasting energy. Now, this happens both within a species and between different species as well. So, different species of plant will compete to get to the sunlight first, for example. In the screen here, you see a lot of examples of interspecific competition, or competition among members of the same species. But sometimes different species also compete, which takes us to the idea of competitive exclusion principle, which we'll talk about in a second in this video. Before that, now there can also be sometimes relationships where one organism hurts the other, but it doesn't actually gain anything out of it. So it's not really competition or parasitism. It's just kind of like, I'm sorry I messed you up, man, but I wasn't really trying to. I wasn't really gaining anything out of it. Basically, elephants have to prefer to eat a certain kind of tree in a savanna, for example. But if there's a tree that happens to be on the way of that elephant getting to the tree that it wants, well, you know, my bad. I'm going to rip you away. So those trees are going to be destroyed or trampled over by the elephant, literally. And in fact, that's why the savanna stays a savanna, because it could even be a tropical dry forest, but the elephants don't let it, because they just pretty much destroy the trees in the process of their trying to get their food. There's a keystone species because they're doing that. Now, if that plant develops thorns or something to try to compete with the elephant for the space, then it becomes more of a competitive relationship. But in this case, where the elephant is just destroying the actual plant, we call it a amensalism, where one gets hurt and the other one neither benefits nor gets hurt from the circumstances that happen. It also happens when things like a branch of a tree falls down on another one. It's an accident. It's hurting the other one, but it didn't meant to do it, and it's not gaining anything out of it. Another type of relationship that happens sometimes is called facilitation. And that's the process by which one organism makes the life of others possible. But it's not really symbiotic. It's not like the other organisms rely on that. It's more like the other organisms kind of get helped by the presence of that organism. Look like the juncus in the salt marsh actually allows a greater diversity of plants to be around it just because the juncus is around it. So the juncus facilitates the diversity of the ecosystem. Now, I talked about the fact that competition is going to be a major factor. And the major thing that things will compete, especially different species, is for the niche. Now, the niche is the role of an organism in its ecosystem. It's everything the organism does, and everything the organism gets, and everything the organism lives, everything about the organism, its role and place within the environment. And organisms will fight to establish their niches, for their territories, for their roles. And wherever there's areas where both of them compete, for example, maybe organism 1 likes moist and cold environments. Organism 2 likes them moist, but not too moist, and also not too hot, but not too cold. But there's going to be an area where both of them overlap. In that area, they will compete, and only the best of them can get to live in that area. And that's the idea of competitive exclusion principle. That because the organisms will be fighting for resources and for parts of the environment, they won't be able to sustain in all circumstances to coexist. In fact, only one of them can coexist, which means they have to split the environment apart, and that's typically what happens. The areas where they don't compete with each other is the areas where they will spend most of their time. Now, does that mean that they couldn't expand to a different area? Maybe they could. But if there's already someone living there that does better there than they do, they just kind of chill out where they are the kings of the hill. And this is called resource partitioning, when they kind of split. Notice how several examples, and we talked about this in the other video, like the barnacle, for example. Now, what this means is that there are two things. There is the animal's fundamental niche, which is how much the animal can do, and then the realized niche, which is what the animal is actually doing in the environment. If it wasn't for the other ones, perhaps it could have done more, which means sometimes the animal has a greater tolerance than it actually seems to have. For example, certain barnacles can live all the way from high tide to low tide. But if another barnacle that outperforms this barnacle lives in the low tide, then that barnacle gets displaced from the low tide. So he could tolerate more, but he doesn't because he competes, and in that case, the other barnacle is better. But notice that the barnacle that won in the low tide does not win in the high tide. And because they're not competing in every single shape, sense, and form, that means that they actually coexist in some places of the environment. Now, that's pretty much what the niche is, and why you see certain areas where green is more common and other areas where yellow is more common. Because each one of those micro areas has a different set of biotic and abiotic conditions, which makes it better for that animal. Now, it can be a million things. It's not just moisture and precipitation. It's the amount of soil, the amount of nutrients, how much predation you have, everything about the animal or the organism and what it does in its environment. Now, because this is actually very important for evolution, because as organisms expand into different environments, they're trying to establish different niches as the niches become available, and as the niches change as they are exposed to different environments, which explains why the Galapagos finches that Darwin looked at all kind of split from where they were used to be in the natural ancestor as they hit environments that had different niches. It's adapt or die. Likewise, as the environment changes throughout time through processes like, geological events, it creates new environments where the animals kind of have to figure it out, the new niches. So niches are not stable through time, but as organisms evolve, so do their functions or roles in the ecosystems. And sometimes, whenever they compete with each other, they're actually forced away from each other, so they stop, competing, which reduces their chances of survival, and they actually go towards opposite ends. So two birds which live in different islands will not compete, and they could even have the similar niche. But if they live in the same island, which I call a sympatric population, sympatric for same island, allopatric for other island, and that means that if they live in different islands, you don't see them displaced. But if they just live in the same island, because they're competing on that niche, they actually both end up avoiding it to avoid competing with each other. All of these things will create things about evolution and explain why some organisms can actually live and disperse in greater areas than others, and how sometimes, as faced with competition and changing ecosystems, some organisms can adapt while others cannot. But absolutely, niche is a fundamental concept in biology. It's the role of the organisms in the ecosystem, and it's very important, and I hope you learn a lot on this lecture series, and don't do anything that would not make your mama proud.